All right, so welcome to Critical Weight Theory. And in a way, I've got a little bit of a special episode here. Now, I know what you're thinking. All of your episodes are special, Wade. And you know what? I appreciate that sentiment. But no, this time I'm sort of elaborating on an episode I recently made about fairy tales and how they're sort of rewritten to be more pro male than pro female and all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. So if you want to listen to that episode, go ahead. But this is sort of like the new and improved version because I've got a little bit more specific information for you about this. So that's right, we're talking about stories once again on this podcast, not the polished ones we grew up with, but the older ones, the rougher ones, the versions that carried real power before they were cleaned up and repackaged for what was considered polite society. Of course, society was still plenty rude back then in manifold ways. In fact, if you look back at how history was, you might say, oh, we're actually more polite now in some ways and toward certain people. And that would actually be accurate. So we're going to get into that a little bit. So for a long time, fairy tales lived in kitchens, courtyards, and spinning rooms. It was often women telling them to each other or to their children. And in these oral traditions, these oral versions, the heroines were not passive in most cases. They were often clever, bold, sometimes even sexually assertive. They survived by outsmarting men who thought they had all the power. A happy ending did not always involve a prince. Sometimes the win was a woman carving out her own independence or beating a man at his own game. But then those pesky men began collecting these stories. They wrote them down, edited them, and reframed them. And apparently there's some truth to this because, well, for one thing, fairy tales tend to have many different versions. And a lot of these stories, they actually did have versions that were more, I guess you could say, empowering to women. But the result of some of these collections was a slow sanitization, you might say, a moral rewrite. The raw, subversive energy of those earlier tales was smoothed out. Female agency gave way to tidy virtues and proper manners, and it might have made the stories more boring in some cases. The chaos that had made the stories feel alive originally was replaced with a single message: be good, be quiet, and maybe you will get your happily ever after. But, how often do we get our happily ever after anyway? If that's, the message that we're supposed to take home. Yes, it is largely true that men rewrote and collected fairy tales in ways that reinforced what are called patriarchal views, often modifying or erasing earlier versions of stories that were less restrictive for women. The original oral folk tales, many of which were shared by women, often featured strong female characters. And women were often, though not always, the original storytellers. For centuries, folk tales were passed down orally, with many being old wives' tales. And where have you heard that term before? Well, in some cases, it was literal tales, not just myths, but actual stories that were shared among women at social gatherings. And these early versions often included clever, resourceful, or powerful female protagonists who were less focused on marriage and more focused on survival and agency. And again, that changed because of the influence of male collectors and writers to a large degree. As the stories were written down in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, male authors and folklorists, most notably Charles Perrault and the Brothers Grimm, made significant editorial changes that reshaped narratives to reflect the more patriarchal social norms of their time. Removal of female agency was definitely a factor. Earlier stories often showed heroines actively resolving their own problems, but the rewritten versions often made them more passive. The new versions emphasized that a woman's virtue and beauty were her most valuable traits, and that salvation would come from a man. And of course, there was an emphasis on morality. Writers like the Grimms added moralizing lessons to the tales, often eliminating sexual or offensive elements, what they might consider offensive, and adding Christian expressions. The lessons often emphasized that gender roles, were significant and deemed appropriate at the time, with women being relegated to the domestic sphere. That's one of the things emphasized in Cinderella, for example. And of course, there was more of an emphasis on the introduction of evildoer women. While older women in the oral tradition could be wise and powerful, like goddesses or fairies, male collectors often changed them into malicious witches, evil stepmothers, or envious queens. This created a rigid young woman good, old woman bad dichotomy, which is evidenced in stories like Snow White. And that there's even a term for that type of character, which is the old crone, like a withered old crone or something like that. And really, all a crone is just a woman who is old. She might be ravaged by age, you might say, and that's usually something that makes her more evil or something like that. And if you think about a lot of stories, like the monsters or the bad guys in the story usually are depicted as like physically less appealing, and that's not just to do with women. Like Freddy Krueger, for example, he's a burn victim. Now it just so happens that the story actually gives a reason for his disfigurement, of course. So that story is a little bit more complicated, but quite often in these types of stories, either ancient fairy tales or newer stories, the antagonist is made ugly in some way. And of course, that's not how real life always is. Sometimes, I mean, I'm not going to be the arbiter of what is attractive and what is ugly here, but just saying generically, sometimes the ugliest people you're going to meet in life, the least physically appealing, are actually some of the nicest people you're going to meet. And I'll let you decide what I mean by ugly. I think we all have some rough ideas, and certainly compared to some people, I would be considered ugly myself. So I'm not saying I'm a beauty pageant winner or anything like that myself, but I'm just saying we tend to have this weird thing where we attribute morality to people who are beautiful or whatever, who are vain and really care a great deal about their appearance and their looks. And it's a bit strange. And there's also the sanitizing effect of Disney. Walt Disney's 20th century animated films further sanitized and simplified collected stories for a family audience. To contrast with the hardships of the Great Depression, Disney added themes of happiness and hopefulness, for example, while often softening or removing the darker, more gruesome elements of the grim fairy tale versions. So, previously it sounded like I was just bashing the grim fairy tales, but actually, in some ways, Disney has been worse because it takes a lot of the edge away from these stories. And sure, you might argue that little kids, they might get too scared if this story is scary, and I suppose that's true. But it's really a matter of debate. To what extent should we water down tales to make the frightening less frightening and the good more exaggeratedly good? In a way, you might argue that it's like you're lying to your kids or something. I don't know, to put it bluntly. And it's about the sanitizing effect of Disney that I'm talking about here. Walt Disney's 20th century animated films really did further sanitize and simplify a lot of these stories. And in the well, for an example, in the grim version of Cinderella, the stepsisters mutilate their feet to fit into the slipper and have their eyes pecked out by birds at the end, Alfred Hitchcock style. Disney, however, followed the more romantic and less violent version, which features the fairy godmother and a happy ending without grisly punishment. So, in that case, you might actually understand watering it down a little bit because, getting your eyes pecked out, that might scare a child, I suppose. But the point is, these stories have really been altered in one way or the other. And in modern retellings, I guess there's a little bit more of an effort to bring back the strong female characters. And a lot of people, they're like anti SJWs, they might be conservatives, and they might scoff at this effort in some ways. And they'll sometimes point out examples of it being done well, like in Aliens with Sigourney Weaver, and sure enough, that is done better than some of these Disney versions of the strong female character. But nevertheless, I think it's commendable, just in a very general way, to try to have those types of characters so they're not all just, I don't know, damsels in distress or whatever. I think that does make more compelling stories, and it is refreshing that an effort is being made, but sometimes it's being made in a, I guess, not so brilliant way. It's kind of obvious that they're pandering in some cases to like a feminist narrative, and I do apologize to the feminists out there. I'm not saying that all of the feminist talking points are necessarily wrong or anything, but sometimes you can tell when it's pandering, and that's sometimes just bad storytelling. I'll just say it like that. And feminist authors and scholars have been reclaiming and reinterpreting fairy tales to subvert patriarchal norms in their view. They often draw on the earlier pre collected folk traditions to give female characters autonomy and challenge conventional gender roles. And the modern movement of retelling fairy tales aims to restore the complexity and agency that was lost over centuries of patriarchal revision. And, to expand on this point, one of the critiques of horror movies is, of course, the damsel in distress, too. Like, George A. Romero himself made fun of Night of the Living Dead for the character of Barbara being just, well, frankly, a weak character overall. Now, I would say it can be more complex than that. You might say that she was uniquely disturbed by what happened, by what she witnessed, and I guess it could have been balanced out a little bit more by having a male character who was similar to Barbara in the group or something like that. But nevertheless, the emphasis seemed to be on a weak female character who couldn't handle the stress and basically was zombie food and destined to be as such. And it's something that I think we're never going to completely get correct, because I mean there's always going to be criticisms of you went too far in this direction or you went too far in that direction. And it's like it's like another trope about the black character in a horror movie being the first to die. Well, that's not always true. And then you have to wonder, well, is it necessarily, a racist thing if the black character is the first to die? I mean, could you never have that in a movie? I mean, there are different aspects of it that you could debate, and I don't know if we're ever going to get a definitive answer on that one. And it's like when it comes to weak female characters, are you really going to tell me there are no women who are like those characters? Of course there are, and of course there are weak male characters. So really, the best way to balance these things out is to you know make the stories complex, make the characters unique, make them not so obviously relatable to tropes, and then you're possibly on your way to resolving whatever sorts of issues you might perceive if you're a storyteller. Anyway, the broader social agenda is a significant thing. A lot of them are a lot of tales are reshaped to encapsulate an idea. And today we see the same thing happen with political language. Take the phrase stay woke, for example. It started as a call for awareness, especially around racial injustice, like police violence or the perception that the government is just harming people. Then right leaning rhetoric grabbed it, flipped it, and turned woke into sort of a pathetic insult. So you hear about the woke mind virus and stuff like that. Even though, frankly, the quote unquote anti woke mind virus is actually a thing as well. And I think it's actually worse. At least, at least one version I think strives for a greater good and is more about creating a better society with better outcomes for more people. And the alternative is, I mean, what is it to cry about it every time you have a concern about a just outcome in a given environment? I mean, it's a little bit funny because woke and woke mind virus, they're the same word essentially, but there's a very different use. And just like with fairy tales, people sometimes assume these reframings come from a single mastermind pulling strings behind a curtain. They don't. Narratives grow out of politics, media habits, and the ongoing churn of the culture war. You get many voices, many motives, no single source. And this brings us to a small but relevant linguistic point. Just because someone says something is the same as the original does not mean it is the original. Language lets us link ideas in all sorts of ways, especially through copular sentences, the kind built around the verb to be. When you hear a whale is a mammal or someone is a great athlete, that is a predicate nominative. It gives a new identity or category to the subject. It is simple, but it shapes how we think. And when you scale that up to politics and culture, these tiny constructions turn into powerful tools. They can clarify, they can distort, they can rewrite an entire worldview. So, whether we're talking about old tales reshaped by collectors or modern slogans twisted by culture war pundits, the pattern stays roughly the same. Stories get rewritten, meanings shift, and if we're not paying attention, we lose the original spark that once made the bold, strange, and alive story. And that's about it for this episode. Thanks for listening. And remember, sometimes it's good to let your stories stay wild and not water them down too much.